Are y'all ready to get this started?
Let's go.
3, 2, 1.
Let's get it. Here we go.
Sit your ass down and get ready for the next episode of the Urban Green Room. The Urban Green Room. With your hosts, my girl A.A. and that dude D. Lewis.
Hey everyone, it's your girl A.A.
What's up, world? It's your man D. Lewis.
And welcome to another episode of the Urban Green Room podcast. I am so excited tonight because we are picking up on a much needed discussion on the injustices that are happening across our country and across the globe. And as promised, we are back with the second episode of Fight the Power.
So we got Marques Banks back in the house. I hope you guys didn't miss part one. If you did, go back and take a listen to that. But Marques is a civil rights attorney, and we spoke at length on, far as the system and how it's designed and how it's working exactly how it's supposed to be working. So we had a great discussion on that. But also tonight we have a new face to the Urban Green Room. I'd like everybody to welcome Abi Hassen. Abi Hassen is a colleague of Marques Banks. So they've been working in tangent as far as the work goes with civil rights and people needing legal advice, attorneys. So both of these guys are very active and what's happening across the country right now as far as our folks go and trying to get our civil liberties. So welcome to the Urban Green Room, guys. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Anytime. So I want to kind of switch gears for part two, Marques and Abi. So I want for us that are uneducated about civil rights movements, kind of take us through what does building and organizing, what does that look like for us, and where are we in that, in what stage, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so Abi, were you about to go? I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, like, what does that look like and what phase are we in now, in a sense? And I think one of the things I want to highlight is the importance of organizing and base building just across movements and how historically that's been. I mean, we see that's always been at the foundation of social justice movements from the church, from people just going door knocking. And I think it's very important to highlight how organizing is taking place to build these social justice movements over time. I think one of the things that's very interesting now is that there's a lot of opinions about what's going on in the Black Lives Matter movement context about sort of like what's next, what are people doing, what are the purposes of these protests. And I think people need to understand, one of the things I want to get across is like how protests have also been sort of not like, it's never an end all be all with protests, but how protests have sort of shaped social justice movements and organizing in the sense where specifically, like I'll talk about an example here in DC, is that, after Ferguson, there was a lot of protests that were going on. And from that, it was a way for people to sort of meet and come together and find other like-minded individuals, and organizations were formed from those protests. One of the things that sort of one of the things that was not necessarily missing, but one of the things that wasn't being done as much is like, that's how people were some of their introductions into some of these movements and whatnot, but from the past in the historical context, there's been like door knocking, base building, building power amongst community in smaller forms and growing that out. So I think right now it's hard to say which phase it's necessarily in. I think you see a lot of mobilization going on, but in order to answer that, you got to look at it from each local level because there's so many different movements within this grand movement as well.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to get, I think you're in line with another question I wanted to ask a little bit, but Abi, did you have anything to add to Marques's comment?
Yeah, I think I largely agree with Marcus, but I think that the way I like to look at it is, you know, you need you need to have, if you want to build power, I like to kind of flip the script sometimes and think about why do the institutions and forces that we are fighting against or that are oppressing us or that are harming us have power, and how do they build and exert that power? And because sometimes it's helpful to understand that's helpful to understand how power operates in
Hmm.
society. And so, one of the things I like to conceptualize it as, you know, think about it as what is power? And in some ways, one concept, one framework you can look at it is three things. Power is the ability to control time, space, and information, right? So
Right.
if you look at that from that kind of, that trifecta perspective, right? The institutions that are hurting us have buildings, they have space, right? They have time in that they have money to pay people to do the work. People's lives are dedicated to these institutions because they're paid for their time, right? Even when we think about police aren't doing it, for large part, police aren't doing their job because they are trying to knock heads. Some of them are, most of them are doing their job because they're paid to do it, right? That's what people do, right? Everyone needs a job. So that time factor. And then if you think about information and the ability to control information and maintain information over time, right? Maintain information, practices, laws, all of those things. And when you think about it in our context, in the movement context, we're often replicating information, doing the same thing over and over and over, because we don't have often institutions that are keeping that information for us. And these are all related, and all these things happen in a kind of dynamical process. But like, to go back to what Marcus was saying, like a mobilization, a protest, that is largely an instantaneous thing that will happen over some smaller periods of time. And often, there's organizations, institutions that help promote it, but the energy, the vibrancy isn't maintained through time. So how do we go from that moment on the streets, those moments, those shorter moments, into more sustained long-term? We have to build institutions, we have to build organizations, we have to connect and share and maintain our information. But then when we're talking about for a movement, that has to be multiple organizations across, really ideally across the globe, is how we make like large scale movement change. Requires all of that happening across space, across time. So
Okay.
where so to come back to sorry to come back to answer, like, where are we now, right? I think we have more, we kind of have more protest than we have long-term sustainable institutions and organizations right now. That's my perspective.
Gotcha. So a lot of it is just position power. We're not in positions to be able to have power to make large movements in the system. So if what I'm hearing right, we don't have enough money, we don't have the information, far as we don't make the laws. We need more of us in those types of positions, and then we need buildings and institutions to be able to harness the information to be able to share with the rest of us. Is so on a small scale, is that what you're saying? I mean, not
Yeah,
verbatim,
yeah,
but kind of the idea.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So we can, how do we get to that space? How do we get there to where we can sustain a movement? Where, how are you guys thinking? What are you seeing on the ground level that you're telling, your folks you interact with every day? This is how we need to start moving so we can get these things, so we can have more power.
I mean, I can, I think that one thing that we're seeing is an increased, as Marcus mentioned, base building, an increased interest in organizing and learning those practices in that kind of learning those skills of running campaigns, door knocking, just face-to-face organizing, building, in some sense, the bricks and mortar for movement organizations aren't just those physical spaces, but are those cultural and movement practices, right? Of building accountability, of building relationships, of building networks of trust, of education, political education, of history, right? Learning our history, learning learning from each other, right? Like even like what you're doing with your podcast, right? That is the kind of bricks and mortar of building movements. Is all of those things have to be built together. And I always want to bring back the value of physical space, because physical space is what facilitates that and what helps maintain it through time. And that's one of the hardest things for us to do. I mean, I think we've seen movements take over a lot of cyberspace, and there's a lot of movement talk in the ether and the internet, but I think in some sense one of the problems with that is it's much harder to build deeper relationships in that space. It's much easier to fight with each other and tear each other apart, as opposed to in physical space where it's more facilitating to build community and build trust and frankly to build love, right? And that's what sustains ultimately a movement, right?
So what do we?
Go ahead, Marcus.
Oh, go ahead, Marcus.
Yeah, so I think to piggyback on that is just like the foundations of institution building go hand in hand with organizing. And so when you think about it, when we're telling people what we're trying to say is like when we're building power of building institutions, and sort of like to hone in a little bit to give an example of what Abi's saying of like holding that space. One of our biggest institutions are HBCUs. And that culture and that history has that physical space that's constantly replicated over time, where it's holding that information. You know that that's a gathering space. You know that that's where people come. When you're going to a HBCU, you're going for that history. You're going for that culture. And one of the things that I'm trying to do, especially with social justice movements, is build that up again. I mean, and that information is so important. And just thinking about other movements and other organizations of the past, like, one of the things that I own in on is like the Black Panther Party, like, and so many other parties, SNCC and so many others had rules about like how much information, like there was trainings you had to go through before you could just be a member, and sort of like, and they had those institutions and then building those up. And so those over time, you still do have SNCC members, you still have some replications of it, but over time, and we talked about this, is like, because of the government, how they were shut down, in some of those cases, that we're at a space where we're re-getting that information and building those things back up and trying to build those organizations out. So we're relearning that history. And right now, as Abi was saying, in the cyberspace, sometimes it gets somewhat hard because you don't have that relationship building. But coming together in numbers, building power, having that information, learning from our past, to know, like, everything didn't work as peaches and cream as like they would go ahead and tell us. There was a lot of struggle, and just learning from that, learning the mistakes and learning the successes and building that up for the next step. I think that's where we're trying to be at now.
Okay, makes sense, Mama.
So, in having a conversation with someone else outside of this group, when I hear individuals say the behaviors or the steps that we have to take for the movement right now, for us to unite, to be educated, it's taken too long. Like, what are we saying to that process? And can you speak to why these behaviors towards the movement, organizing, being educated, why is that so important versus us just having a reaction to a situation and trying to organize in that moment? Why do we have to have these steps in place in order for us to be successful?
I like to think about it as, if you think about like a sand castle, or think about like a model of a city in the sand, on the beach, right? And when we have these moments of crisis, when we have these moments of, you know, of things being shuffled around, right? Of moments of change, that think of that as the wave coming in, right? But after that wave, the outline of what was there before is going to remain. And so the institutions and structures that are on the ground in moments of change are going to be the ones that are maintained through that moment of change largely. So that's why I think it's so important. Like when we're talking about defund the police, we have to lower the profile of the institutions that are hurting us and raise the profile of the institutions and organizations that are going to sustain us, right? Like even if you think about, like, you know, a perfect example from recent history, if you think about Egypt, there was a revolution in Egypt on the streets, but the institution, what was the institution that remained? The military. Now they're running the country again, right? Because that was the strongest institution on the ground even after the revolution, right? And that's how we have to understand how things change. It doesn't just come up from nowhere. Everything that exists is going to keep existing unless we get rid of it. And like, and those powers are going to come back to haunt us if we don't lower their profile now, and if we don't raise the profile of new things that are going to replace them.
And that, I guess, kind of makes sense. That makes a lot of sense to me as to kind of what happened even after, you know, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where there was some movement. There was a lot of movement of what happened. But I think one of the things is, like you were saying, the institutions that control that power were still up here, you know, so we didn't create enough movement to be able to sustain it, along with, you know, some other factors in there. But that makes a lot of sense in my mind as to why, you know, we didn't progress further than where we are kind of today.
Yeah, and I think part of that, like you were saying, like, I don't think people understand how high the institution of policing and this government and capitalism sort of is. And so when we're talking about raising our institution, like and lowering that one, we have a long way to go to lower those institutions and the powers. Like when you talk about the 60s and 70s and some of these different organizations, I think it's, you know, some people are just like, oh, well, some of these things are not around. Like there's a reason why they're not around. Like we got to look at the history of like policing and what the government did to destroy those organizations. Like that's all very important. And that's going back to like, that's one of the institutions that we're fighting against. And so you have to be mindful of that when you're sort of thinking about that. And to your point, AA, when you was like, you know, it's not moving fast enough or whatnot. But if you go ahead and look, like, I think the way history is sort of told by individuals, sometimes it happens a lot faster in this new narrative that they kind of create to fit what they want in a sense. And I like having these sustained movements over time, like nothing was done overnight. Everything sort of built up over time. Like people want to ignore the fact that, you know, especially with the passing of John Lewis, there's a lot of things talking about Selma. Like there was multiple marches on Selma before they actually were able to cross the bridge. Like there was so many things that went on. Like there was multiple organizations and marches on Washington for hundreds of years, starting in the 1800s. And like all of these things were sustained movements over time. And one of the things that I sort of think about when I think about our place in this is just like, this is a continue for me, the movement started, you know, 1619, our kidnapping and the start of struggle and liberation started from that point on. And this is all a continuation of that larger movement. And there's different ways to sustain it and trying to build up our institutions. So we've had some victories and we've had some, you know, we had some setbacks, but I think it's the ongoing thing. So it definitely takes some time for some of the things that we wanted to accomplish. I mean, even the quote, you know, when people think about, like you said, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, everyone wants to put it all in sort of like a 3-day event. You know, there was a bus boycott. There was then MLK the Martin Luther King gave a speech, and then lo and behold, then the Civil Rights Amendment was passed. which people forget, like one of the catalysts that sort of pushed stuff into hyperdrive, similar to how we seen with a Mike Brown situation, a George Floyd situation, was Emmett Till. Death was sort of like a catalyst moment to sort of push things in a fast pace. But that happened in the 50s. And a lot of things that we're talking about happened later on in the 60s, almost 10 years later, like further along. So it takes time. It takes building these institutions. And that education is very important. That's why a lot of those organizations were starting to say, like, you know, we have to have this educational component to our, you know, to our structure for you before you can even get on board, in a sense, to say you're a member of this. And the reason why that's important, because if you don't know what you're fighting against sometimes, or if you don't know how these systems work, if you don't have that political education, it's very easy to get swept back in, and you're replicating some of the same harms that these institutions that are already doing, because we don't realize how ingrained it is into our system. Like when you start talking against capitalism, I think people don't understand like how ingrained capitalism is into our society, and then how much of it actually harms people. And so like that political education is very important. So if you don't know what you're trying to change or how these all work together, then we're going to be back at square one without that education.
Yeah, and you know, just to build on that, you know, since the 70s, especially if you look at, you know, some of the core institutions that supported movements of the past, being unions, labor, have been on a just steady decline year after year since the early 70s, right? And if you think about the other institutions that sustained movements of the 60s and 70s, mostly Southern Black churches, but churches across the board are also on the decline, and many of them are antithetical to movement concepts, right? Especially if you talk about anti-capitalism, you know. So we've got a lot of churches even that are capitalist enterprises for all intents and purposes, right? So we're in, that, and those two types of institutions were the meeting spaces, were the like nexus for so much of what happened in the prior generations movement. So also universities, but if we think about even the changing nature of the university, pushing out especially poor Black and brown folks, loading us up with debt, so we have to take corporate jobs or make money and never take a risk, right, in life. And so those kind of things all are impediments to build, when we think about how the movements of the past were created. And I don't want to say that like we have to do everything the way it was done in the past, but we have to understand that the institutions that built prior movements are, if we want to learn from them, like we have to learn those roles and figure out how to overcome a lot of these serious challenges.
For sure, it makes complete sense. Marques and you, Abi, I guess, yeah, both of you kind of touched on this. I want to dive a little bit deeper into it. When you were talking about, Marques, how the movement didn't happen in 3 days, right? A lot of us do have that narrative that it was a wham bam type of thing, and we overcame injustice in a couple years. But we know that wasn't the case. Also, I want to talk about the narrative that people try to put on that particular movement, and especially Dr. King's movement. That seems to be, to me, in my opinion, the only movement that white America recognizes is Dr. King's movement. And their rationalization in that, in my mind, is because they say it was a peaceful movement compared to the Black Panther movement, or you had Malcolm X as well during that time. So all those in my opinion, are movements that were crucial for Black Americans. Every single last one of them. They may have had their differences in some particular issues, but overall, they all were dedicated to the advancement of Black folks. So explain why we get that whitewash theory that Dr. King's movement, that part of the civil rights movement, was peaceful. And do you think it was peaceful?
So I have a problem with the word peaceful of it, because I think only time where someone or the narrative of peaceful is put on, it's never about like the violence that's put on to us. It's always about how we respond. And so that wasn't peaceful to me. When you look at Bloody Sunday, when you look at all the violence that they went through, it wasn't a peaceful situation to me. But I think that it's also, and there was a tactic behind King, and I think what my problem is that King's history and narrative gets whitewashed so much and gets watered down before how radical he is. Even sometimes amongst, people that don't, not just within the media or within the government or whatnot, just like thinking about all the things King stood for, because he was anti-military, anti-capitalist. A lot of things that he pushed back on is that same things that the government is afraid of. And it's one of the reasons why they wanted to push this new narrative of King, of what he actually stood for. And it's just not the case. There's just so much more to it. But I also think it's funny how people, or especially the government, was like, well, this is the right way to protest. And especially in contrast, quote unquote, violent protests, when even just looking at King's experience, like, the protests of those times, people didn't approve of the way King was protesting. It was like 68% of the people didn't agree with the way he was protesting. And then people out here something like, oh, well, why are the people shutting down traffic? Why are they shutting down freeways? It's like, well, King's marches took, like, the Edmonds Bridge was actual freeway or highway at the time, if I'm not mistaken, Abi, isn't that correct? Like, It was a main aware of traffic, and they shut that down. So, like, all
that
these
was
marches
their shining
the
beacon
streets.
Over in that area. They had just finished that thing not too long before that. So they were very adamant that that bridge was not going to get crossed. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, Marcus, that, that King was thought to be too radical amongst the large majority of Black folks before his death, right? So that is that his history has been completely co-opted, right? And that is something that we need to overcome. Like, we need to learn. We need to, J. Edgar Hoover, right? One of the most diabolical figures in American history, a true American fascist, right? Considered Martin Luther King to be the most dangerous man in America, right?
Yep.
That is, it's important to understand, his legacy and his strategies and his tactics were not this idea of he was not co-opted at the time, just so to speak. He was he was confronting power, and so. But going back to this idea of peaceful, and I think that our language, especially when it comes to protest, especially when it comes to the law, is just thoroughly distorted, and it brainwashes you if you listen to it too much, right? Because they would have you believe that living in a society where if you lose your job, you're thrown out on the streets because you can't pay the rent, that's not some kind of violence. That is violence, right? It is violent to threaten a family with death because they can't afford their hospital bills. It is violence to have at the beck and call an army of armed men who are trigger happy when it comes to Black folks, right? Like, so the idea that that this is a non-violent society is an absurdity, right? Like, we live in a society whose baseline is violence, right?
Yeah.
So
the country was built on violence.
Absolutely, the country was built on theft and chattel slavery, right? So there's a deep violence built into so much of our society that we're told doesn't exist, and so then you get these notions of oh, this person was violent and that person wasn't violent. But, again, like, but again, and let's disambiguate nonviolence as a tactic, right? Versus
Right.
nonviolence as some form of moralistic ideal, right? I don't think that King or Gandhi or any of the famous nonviolent leaders, right, saw there's quotes, you can find quotes from Gandhi saying that, like, he would support the violent faction of the movement over the opposition, over the government, over the British Empire, right? Because he just disagreed. There's a difference between tactics and that kind of moral philosophy, right? So many of the famous nonviolent leaders wanted to implement nonviolence as a tactic because, for lots of different reasons, but one of them being the opposition generally was more heavily armed. And to enter into an armed conflict with a more heavily armed opposition is a losing strategy, right?
Absolutely.
So we got to think about these things a little more deeply than they would have us.
To build on that too, I also want to say a lot of people don't understand that King especially also believed that in order to make this thing successful, we were going to need white people's support. And at the time, the passive white folks, the only way they were going to get more involved was to actually see what was going on in the southern states. So, he would tell his followers, listen, we're not going to raise a hand. We're not going to fight back because we're going to show the rest of the country how things actually are being done to us down here. So, that was part of the tactic in order to get more support.
To piggyback on that a little bit, I mean, and even so, I mean, I would even push back a little bit as we're talking about like language and being mindful of what we're saying. Like King still was fighting back.
Oh yeah.
But when we're talking about like how important language is to say, like, because then people start going ahead and replicating like that. Oh, he didn't raise a hand, he didn't fight back. Then you have people in certain corners like, oh, I don't follow King because he wouldn't fight back. But that's not the case. King was definitely fighting back. King was definitely pushing back the system. Like Abi just said, one of the most dangerous, he was considered the most dangerous man in America at the time. But I think like part of that tactic was one of the purposes of that was to appeal to some of the moral compass internationally and broader, which was to sort of show show the violence that was already within our society in a larger scale to other people to be more sympathetic to help out with the social justice movement at that time. And I think that also was very important when we're talking about like some of the support of what people were getting. But to your point earlier is that there was also other movements that were going on who would take up arms, who would do this, like, and those all, when we look at that time in history, like all of that plays hand in hand. Like it wasn't just one organization or wasn't just one thing that launched the 60s, 70s, or the 50s, 60s, 70s as we know it. Like all of those things played a role into each other. Like I will never cry over a burnt building, never. But when Black lives are dying and on the street, that's what gets to me. And so I'm not upset about CVS being on fire compared to George Floyd saying I can't breathe, compared to Breonna Taylor being in her house and not being safe. That's just something that I won't do. But then it's also like the tactic of that moral, like appealing to the moral compass, I think needs to be not necessarily that we want to bend the moral arc. But I think one of the things that's a problem is that now, like so much of it is seen and so much is widely available, and I'm just concerned about the moral arc of America, where they just don't care, in a sense. And I think like since 2014, and before this, because Abi's been involved before this, but like 2014 is sort of my indoctrination into like protesting and movements and whatnot, and so. Facts that I think people just don't know. Like after Mike Brown, there was almost a protest every day or at least once a week for about a year. But as soon as the buildings weren't on fire anymore, no more news was covering the constant protests going on. In 2015, right after that, then Baltimore happened, and then Minneapolis happened, Baton Rouge. all of these places have been doing protests. There's been a movement or protest or in some state or form, like this has been a constant fight for 6 years. Actually, before that, I'm saying the 6 years since since Black Lives Matter, we're talking about like a Black Lives Matter movement or the movement for Black Lives, has been a continuation for 6 years, and there hasn't been cameras, there hasn't been moral outrage. In fact, when people try to protest the way that they said that they should, people still disregard it, like, get out of here. You had Colin that was kneeling in the sense like, okay, we're going to do this type of protest, and people are like, okay, we're going to constantly do these marches. They were constantly ignored. But as soon as CBS is on fire, everyone seems to want to go ahead and weigh an opinion on it. And then after that, like, stuff started getting changed because they know, like, this will not be sustained if we keep on doing nothing. And more of our precious CBSs, more of our precious targets are on fire, then we're going to have a problem. So that's when things started to change as well. And that goes to the show. But also, you also had people that were fed up for years. And so those other marches, like, that played a role into the environment that we're in as well. So all of those played hand in hand. Like, you also had that fatigue. You also had people like looking at, Colin Kaepernick's, the different marches, and like, yes, this is what you should do. This is what you do. Then they're starting to see like, wow, okay, we need something else. And so now it's like how Abi was sort of saying, like, things that Gandhi said and what King said, like, a riot is the voice of the unheard, to the point where if we don't get it, or if things aren't enough, if you ignore us for so long, there's going to be other things that happen. And so we just need to be mindful of that when we're talking about all of these things. I mean, so much took place even after the uprisings in the 60s. There was a lot of changes made after that, but just be mindful of how all of these things play together.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just a quick point to add to that, that's important for understanding the current context versus the prior generation, is the Cold War was a huge factor in that kind of global position. Like, first of all, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, America was, an industrialized nation on the rise, and we are now a deindustrialized nation on the decline, largely, right? And so, but there was also the Cold War, where America was trying to project an image to the world of democracy, freedom, all that stuff, as opposed to the tyrannical Soviets, right? So that was a softening of the kind of liberal center of American political and social life, right? Because there was a concern that, the rest of the world is particularly looking at Africa, Asia, the third world, might turn against America if it looks like America is too oppressive to its own people, is too oppressive to, Black and brown people at home, right? So we don't have that anymore, right? And I think that a scary thing is, I think more and more nations and leaders on the far right are starting to recognize that they don't have to pretend to be humanitarian to us anymore, right? And unfortunately, I feel like that's a direction that we're moving in.
Okay, yeah, I would agree with that. So we got time for one last question. So where do we go from here? Where do we go now?
It's a good book. Right. I mean, seriously, reading that book, and the debates between King and Stokely Carmichael at the time are just an incredibly useful tool for today, frankly. But sorry, go ahead, Marcus.
No, I mean, it's I think the part that's not necessarily hard for me, but one thing that I want people to realize is, like, there's no right answer completely of just like, this is the one way we have to go, in a sense. I mentioned before previously, like, the plugging into different organizations, and we've been talking about how important organizing and institution building is. So I think what you're seeing now is that protests are happening. I mean, this was one of the first times in my life where every state had a major protest that was going on. And I'm sure there's different ways that you can plug into your city. And, some places like DC protests still going on, New York protests still going on, different, like, you see what's going on in Portland. I think there's so many ways that different people can plug in. You are now talking about something that I mentioned on the podcast before, was like defund the police. which is now a common theme that people are sort of talking about and like learning more about that and what that means. And so I think one of the things that you definitely do is like plug in and get and find out if there are any institutions in your city and how you can start to build those up. Start organizing, meeting with people. And if there aren't any organizations, which, you know, I find that so hard to believe in most of the major cities, because I had that same mind frame of like, okay, well, what's going on? But I can almost guarantee that there's something going on. And start organizing, deal with them, and you'll probably start seeing them, some of them at the protest, and you can use that. Like there was like 7 different organizations from the protest in DC in 2014 that were protests. Figuring out, I think political education is really key that we have to do. And so there's like a lot of books and a lot of things. We need to learn the history of social justice movements, not just like we definitely have a lot of history that has been erased to learn, but I think learning about the history of different movements over time, what worked for them, what were some of the successes, how were they derailed, how was the government has sort of shut those down. I think all of that is very important, and start to learn about that. And then like figuring out, because I think a lot of people, like a lot of these concepts are new to people, and they're like, because they're new, people sort of dismiss them sometimes or get defensive. It's hard to envision a world that hasn't been created yet, which is initially what an organizer's job is doing, is creating this world that doesn't yet exist. And so sometimes that can be afraid, because when you start saying, you know, police aren't the things that keep us safe, and people are like, well, what's going to keep us safe? So, and that's part of like political education, where you start looking at like actually safety comes from secure housing, safe, secure housing. It comes from adequate healthcare. It comes from a good economics, job security for people. It comes from all these other things that we need to invest in. And so I think just learning about these different systems and how they play is very important as well. Abi, you want to chime in? I'm thinking of some more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's multiple. We have a lot of problems to fix. We need to go in a lot of different places, right? And we need to move a lot of different things. I'll go back to my this is my favorite construct lately, this kind of think about time, space, information. What can you offer in that trifecta, right? What do you have, that you can offer, and come in with that perspective, right? Because, don't only pay attention to what's on TV and being on, if you can't be on the streets for XYZ reason, there's a place for you somewhere else, right? You don't have to only be doing the thing that you see on TV or the most high profile thing. There's space for all kinds of people and all kinds of abilities and all kinds of contributions. And I also want to encourage people, don't neglect, as Marcus said, find an organization that in your, but you also might be part of organizations that can be moved, that can be changed, that can be redirected, right? And thinking back to the labor, maybe your role is to organize your coworkers, right? In your place to build power for your direct community. And that even can free up time and space to do other activism, right? But like, I just want to encourage people to broaden about what we need to do. That it's not just being part of the most high profile thing. It's also doing all those other things. Whether it's letting people stay with you, or helping find people space to organize, or again, organizing your workplace, like all of those things, you're not going to get on TV for, but that's movement building.
Well, I mean, I think that goes directly to the point of what Marcus was saying, that we need to educate ourselves on these other movements, because we saw, and everybody talks about Dr. King and a few others that were prominent figures, but it was all the behind the scenes stuff that allowed them to do what they do. So without those other jobs being done, there wouldn't have been a movement that was as impactful as it was. So yes, I would certainly agree with both of you guys on that point. So it's however we can get involved. Let's figure it out. Search out our local chapters of whatever organization we might want to think about getting involved in, because there's probably several around where you live. And just start there. Start small. Start with something small you can contribute, even if it's, it's monetary or some volunteer work, just whatever it may be. That's probably a really good starting point to build on. So it's about that time. So I want to make sure we get you guys out on time. So we're going to stop there and close out. I'd love to have you back for some more. Marcus, you got one more thought? Is that?
Yeah, I just remember something I was thinking about, like learning about social justice movements and everything. And I think right now is the opportune time, because like just thinking about right now, tomorrow is the kickoff of like Black August. Was talking about like so many social justice movements that have like so many moments within August, within Black liberation movement that have sort of transpired that we need to uplift, recognize, and I think if we stop, one of the things that I hope, because I hate sometimes the comparison of movements of like, oh, well, the civil rights movement compared to now. Sometimes sometimes that sort of like destroys certain things. And I think that's one of the things, like when we talk about the narratives of like, when we hear that most of the time, like from people that are actually against what we're trying to do, like, why don't you protest like King? Why don't you like they're trying to put movements against each other, versus looking at it as like that long continuation of we're still in this Black liberation movement as a whole, and just learning and building off of each other versus just trying to put us against each other.
Yeah, I like that. I like that reasoning better. We're just evolving the way we do things. Everything evolves. So yeah, that's a wonderful point, Marcus. And yeah, that Black August, I just learned about that too. So I do appreciate that. So I think we'll end it here, gentlemen. So just want to let everybody know out there, all the viewers and listeners, we will have our guest information on our website, www.urbangreenroom.net. So make sure you check it out. We'll have contact information. So if you got questions for these guys, or you want a little bit more detailed information about some things you can do, reach out to them. These guys are here for us as a community as a whole. So please, let's take advantage of that. And I want to appreciate and thank you guys one more time for joining us in the Urban Green Room. And we out.
Thank you for tuning into the Urban Green Room podcast. Let's keep the conversation going. Hit us up at urbangreenroom.net or on our Facebook or IG page.
I always follow them.
Tell us what you think about today's conversation. If there's a topic you want to discuss, let us know. And by all means, tell a friend. The Urban Green Room podcast, giving you something to talk about. Until next time, we out.